growth requires more than capital.
Why do we call it the cheat code? Nobody said growth had to be fair.
Revenue solves everything.
Welcome to the cheat code. What was our fastest path to revenue?
We tend to like to do things the hard way.
What's the cheat code? It's giving yourself an unfair advantage over the others.
What is it that really works, and how are we going to grow these organizations?
That's our cheat code.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Go-to-Market Cheat Code. This is Josh Wagner with Justin Gray. Justin, how are you doing today?
Excellente. Thanks for having me, Josh.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to see you, even though you're sitting in the room next door and we had lunch together and I've been staring at your face all day. It's fantastic.
We're sick of one another. Let's get someone else on this podcast.
Someone else on the podcast. That's a great idea. Well, we are in season 3 of the Cheat Code. We are focused on marketing, and no one better to talk about that than today's guest, who, of all things, is a great hang, especially around a campfire in Montana. But more importantly, he's the co-founder and CEO of Be the Stage, host of the podcast, Not Your Average Investor Show. Pablo Gonzalez, welcome to the show.
Josh, Justin, happy to be here, man. Nothing I like to be called more than a good hang, and I appreciate Justin using my native tongue of Spanish and his excelente welcoming us. I feel very comfortable.
You guys should probably give some backstory as well, because now everyone's just wondering why you're at around a bonfire in like rural Montana.
Do we?
Yeah, so I think we talked about it a little bit in prior episodes, but maybe they're not all caught up. So the Arcadia Leadership Experience was put on by two prominent figures in the partner ecosystem of B2B SaaS, Sam and Jason Yarborough. They happen to live in Bozeman, Montana. They wanted to put on a unique corporate event, and this was unique to say the least. It was in their hometown on a small farm just outside of the city. All of the events were there, beautiful backdrop, beautiful scenery. There were pigs and chickens and the whole thing. But as you would imagine, you get a bunch of SaaS professionals out in the wild, and the whiskey starts flowing.
I was going to say, there's a lot of booze, wasn't there?
Yeah, a lot of, well, it started with beers by the creek late afternoon, and then it just eased its way into whiskey by the late hours of the evening. But certain to say we had a good time.
We'll keep it rolling here.
All right. Well, Pablo, like I said, we jump right into it. We only ask one question, and that question is, tell us your ultimate marketing cheat code.
Man, I've never found anything to work better as far as like a way to convince somebody to do business with you than engineering moments where your prospects are overhearing two of your super consumers talk about you without you in the room. So that's my cheat code. I think about how to do that nonstop.
Well, I love that. First of all, it reminds me of the old Salesforce days, bringing together people at dinners and whatnot. But let's maybe start by defining super consumers. I haven't heard that term before.
Super consumers, and a lot of what I use is derived from the framework of category design, right? Super consumers is a book I have behind me. It's a book written by Eddie Yoon, who's one of the category pirates. And it's essentially this concept that he found in his research that in most companies, if you look in their data, you'll find that somewhere like 10 to 20% of their client base is actually responsible for somewhere around 50 to 70% of revenue created, right? Whether it's the folks that buy the super deluxe package or, the enterprise software package or whatever it is, the ones that refer the most people, the ones that are constantly feeding you insights. And that's just data that he figured out in CPG companies. Turns out that in SaaS, that number can be as low as like 1% of your clientele base is responsible for 50 to 70% of the profit that you can create. So these are the people that are all in with you. They speak your same language. They are fanatical about the problem that you solve, and therefore they just have extraordinary value for you.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. So like when you're trying to, you mentioned like engineering those conversations, which is really hard to do and have it come off as authentic. Maybe like what are some examples where you've been able to do that really well that has not only been successful, but the folks involved didn't feel like they were being put on a stage, if you will.
Yeah, listen, if we want to dumb it down and just call it a buzzword, it's community building, right? Like if you can figure out a way to get people to gather around you and be the watering hole for this kind of conversation, that's how you do it. I've got a pretty simple formula of how I've done it in the past. If you want a tangible example, I'll give you a couple, right? That Not Your Average Investor Show is one of these plays. It's this online talk show that we use as the foundation of our podcast that we do once a week. We regularly get about 100 people to show up. Out of those 100 people, about 50 of them come to every single one of them. When someone shows up to a webinar, right, because this is just a Zoom call talking about why you want to invest in rental properties and how great the Jacksonville market is, right? And you're just kind of like checking the box of like, are these people legit? And wow, I can actually talk to the co-founder and ask him a question that I'm not sure I got right from the sales team. And all of a sudden you're met with a barrage of like 40 people in the chat of a webinar that all have a nickname for each other, all have inside jokes. The moment that you ask a question, they all have their own answer. And then 4 of them offer you their phone number of like, oh, just call me. I can talk you through this. I've been investing with these guys for years. That's it. Right. And then we started that in early 2020, and it became really convenient to have by the time that COVID broke out. And by the end of the first year, it became a $40 million channel, but it's evolved into these like events, right? Like we have a yearly event here in Jacksonville, Florida. We have people that are the super consumers that in their hometowns host their own meetups without us around. And, the first time that Jen Filson did it, who we call the fairy godmother of the community, she had like 5 people show up. One of them was somebody that hadn't invested. 30 days later, that dude was an investor. It's a super powerful mechanism of influence.
Yeah, it strikes me that, like when you were talking, I was thinking completely about like user conference, or like not user conferences, but user groups that, kind of spring up around different softwares and so on. And like how much of a bastard, like redheaded stepchild that is for a lot of organizations. Like they don't put any effort into it. It's just kind of this thing that happens. They don't fund it. I've been, in an ecosystem where that was a big part, which was Marketo, to where like that Marketo didn't for a long time even acknowledge that those were like, related to that whatsoever, which is interesting. But what strikes me is like organizations are often really good at like, or some of them are really good at like 1-to-1 or 1 to like a very few. And then they always have the aspiration to jump all the way to the other end of the line and put on like this big, massive, which is what I misspoke and said earlier, like user conference, where it's like, hey, we need to get hundreds of people around and we need to get that critical mass in order to prove that that's even worth doing or, is a viable option for us. It's so strange how people ignore like that, 1 to, a couple dozen, 3 dozen, 4 dozen, like that, to your point, is really fruitful and actually, where people get a lot more value than just kind of being lost in the herd. Is there a reason for that you found, or like what's the why do people miss the mark there?
Oh man, I'm so glad you asked. Listen, I think that our context has changed rapidly, right? Like there's a couple of things that are happening. The value prop of events has changed, right? We used to live under this paradigm where, we just lived this at the Art Arcadia retreat. This is a 1-to-1 execution of something that I would 100% recommend someone do, right? But like the value prop of events was, the event organizer was the one person that had the giant list that was able to draw a big crowd. And if they could draw a big enough crowd, you could go get in this like river of people and, hope to snipe a couple of the folks that or spearfish a couple of the fish they're trying to do, if we're going to keep it germane here, the contextual example. And the way that they drew people there was a list plus access to like really, really great content. But today, that's just not the case. Anybody can build their own list of exactly who they want to do. It's called LinkedIn, right? Anybody can watch the content that they want to watch. It's called YouTube, right? So the value prop of bringing people together has become peer-to-peer collaboration, knowledge exchange, these kinds of things, what we just witnessed in Arcadia, right? So that's the first thing that people really don't understand, is that they're so obsessed with this like giant audience number, and they don't realize that that's not what's pulling people in. Beyond that, the other thing that has happened is that we've been very used to, right? What are business decisions made off of? They're made off of certainty, right? Whether it's hiring somebody, whether it's investing in a new channel, whatever, the person making that decision, it really hinges on the degree of certainty. And as human beings, we've just been very used to certainty coming from track record. How long have you been doing this? Who'd you do it for? Blah, 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 blah. But the fact of the matter is that COVID completely changed the world. And then 2 years later, AI completely changed the world, right? So like now we're like struggling with reconciling this idea that everything we're really laying in bed with digital stuff and realizing how valuable it really is and how that's part of the real world too, not just the digital world. And now AI has completely accelerated this other thing of like how to solve problems. So what do people look for next? When you can't find track record because the best company hasn't been around for more than 2 years, or the best solution hasn't been around for more than 2 years, they look for certainty in familiarity. They look for someone with a similar context to them that's solving the problem that they have in a way that's working for them. And that's why partnerships and community and events have become the 3 channels that are really, really working in go-to-market, right? So like, if you combine those 2 things, you've got to get over this idea of audience, this like huge audience being the thing that you need to do, and proving yourself through certifications and this like long track record, and start understanding that the quickest way that you can convince somebody is to be guilty by association with somebody that they already know, right? Like I was just telling you guys, like, I can't wait to share this podcast, so I'm guilty by association with you guys, right? That's now the quickest way to convince people. And the sooner that we understand that, the more we're going to stop fiddling around with this like weird notion of wanting to be a media company and growing a giant audience and needing to turn your founder into an influencer, and start focusing on like, how can you bring people closer to the nucleus, right? Like, how can you give access to folks, to your executives and stuff like that in a frictionless manner, and to the rest of the people that are in your ecosystem, like your partners, like your super consumers, in a way that aligns all the best interests and creates this like frictionless access to like genuine questions and genuine interactions.
Yeah. Last point, and then Josh, I promise I'll shut up because I know I've been monopolizing this, but like you bring up a really critical point, which is, in terms of the impact of COVID, because like the whole premium content or like interesting content, which used to be, behind the gate of large conferences and so on, you had to go there in order to see the best speakers. Like COVID really did blow that away, because what did everyone, latch onto immediately was like, hey, I'm going to get Mark Cuban on, our company call. And, suddenly like that became the bar that everyone had to meet. And, of course we saw like, 3 months into COVID, everyone was sick of showing up to big webinars, even when the content was like great. Like 6 months prior, you would have been like, oh my God, I'm not going to miss this thing. Now it's like, I can't deal with another one of these shitty webinars. And so like, that's a really interesting call out in terms of like that bar is just gone. Like that's content is available wherever you want to find it these days, but that trust factor is certainly the rarity.
Yeah. I really like that you put kind of the 3-legged stool in your concept there, because when you said community at first, I was kind of like, man, I've seen so many communities just fall off with no engagement and no oomph behind them, right? Like we all been in Slack communities, and Justin mentioned Marketo used to have a LinkedIn community that, they didn't really own, but it was there, kind of moderately monitored and whatnot. But I wrote this in the post-event follow-up from Arcadia that we were talking about is, leading up, there was some activity in the Slack channel, and then the event hit and it just blew up with, hey, I'm on my way. And, people just starting to be humans. It wasn't, hey, I'm, a bot that talks about being the stage, whatever it may be. Then we all show up in this beautiful place. And I think that's part of, if we thread the COVID thing, the accessibility to content, there's that need for feel and connection that is human and unique, right? And that's what I think really happened at Arcadia is you had a group of people that had a common connection through the B2B SaaS and the B2B ecosystem, but it was a pretty darn diverse group of people, right? And it brought a lot of ideas, a lot of connection. And now we're seeing maybe 3-4 weeks out from when that happened, that community, for lack of a better term, seems to be thriving, right? Every day people are posting questions, like legitimate questions, like, hey man, like I'm hiring a CRO. Do you know this person? What types of things should I be thinking about? Right. And this is pretty heavy business stuff, right? These are executive type of things that people are asking about. So I think that's pretty cool. And I think that 3-legged stool that you talked about is what makes it a little bit more unique. Just community on its own, content on its own, but you put those things together, it kind of has an impact. Outside of Arcadia, which we just experienced, and it sounds like you're doing it pretty well with the event you're putting on. What are some of those other things that have been unlocks for you? Because, not everyone has Bozeman, Montana at their disposal to just throw out for an event.
Agreed. Right. Like for me, I've been on this. This is the latest that community comes up in a podcast that I'm on, right? Because I've just been on this like mission of community creation for business development for about 9 years. But for me, man, the way that I learned it, and again, I learned it in really small events, right? I learned it leveraging nonprofits to start these like young professional groups. And the way that I would recruit these young professionals was to say, we host these like little happy hours where you meet somebody that cares at least a little bit more about something else other than themselves. And when we host our little meetings to plan our little happy hours, we're doing it at the meeting room of the board of directors for somebody on the charity. And those are super influential people that you get to start to know. And as the broker of those relationships, I developed a really, really impressive network in Miami. And I parlayed that all the way up to like hosting events for the charities, to becoming a business development person for my company by hosting events with like somebody on the board, with a developer I want to do business with, and, you know, inviting the young professionals, to then joining this like e-commerce startup. And what I really challenged myself with was, like Jason, the first time that I did this thing, like Jason and Sam, it was comprised of people whose relationships I had developed for like 7 years. You know, like it was just being in market for a really, really long time and knowing people. And that always works for that, you know, that profile of person. But how do you speed this thing up was the main challenge, right? How do you deliver speed to win? If I wanted to build community for people, I knew that I had to solve a Monday morning problem, right? Like nobody's getting the Sunday night scaries thinking my boss expects me to like show up with the community on Monday. That's not what's happening, right? They have other needs, right? So it was this idea of like, how do you engineer this like journey to it while providing short-term wins? And what I realized was, and I've now been able to like repeat this process in multiple different contexts and different types of companies and verticals, is that if you can the first thing that a community, a group of people, whatever, people gather around something that we all care about, right? It's that simple. In category design, the thing that you do to get the market to, you know, to join yourself around you it's called a point of view, right? A POV. It's a narrative based on where the world is, what's wrong with it because of recent changes, you know, that how that problem is manifesting in my life. What if it didn't have to exist with this like non-obvious solution to this obvious problem, and how the world looks after. You get that part right, then you design a content stream around that thing, right? For me, my weapon of choice is podcasting, right? If you can start getting a podcast, talking to people about those 5 different pieces, right? Like, what's your context like? What's this world that we want to be in? Who's got some answers? How can it look better? These kinds of things. You start to draw in the partners that you need quickly through these like co-creation exercises, and the super consumers in your community that can't wait to stand up and talk about it. Other experts, right? Like you get to really consolidate that ecosystem. With the podcast, put a ritualized online event that goes with it, whether it's once a month, twice a month, or once a week. You have a live version of the podcast that's now just like, it's not a cheesy online event or a webinar. It's a live version of a podcast, slightly better invite, right? As you start doing that, you start getting people showing up regularly, right? If you're doing that right, and you're putting value into the ecosystem, and within 6 months, you're going to have a really good idea of who are the people that are like super into this thing, who are the past couple of guests that are like underrated and like superstars at the same time. How can you start bringing those folks together? And after about 6 months, you start having, it's pretty clear that you're like, you can host a panel with these like 3 people. When you host the panel as one of the live events, at the end of it, they're all going to be like, man, that was awesome. How do we do this in person? And that's when you're just like, hey, what's the next conference we're all going to? Why don't we run an activation at this conference together? Now you have an in-person event to like aim the gun at, right? If you rinse and repeat that for somewhere between like 18 to 24 months, it ends with your user event, where you already have a built-in group of people that are going to say yes the moment that you announce it. That as soon as they do that, you can now use that to promote, to get other people to come. And you're going to get 25 to 100 people of exactly who you want in one room to do something like we did in our.
Do you have to start with, I hate to put it this way, but like knowing explicitly what you're selling, like, you know, what you need to get out of it, right? Like, I don't know, for your real estate group, right? Is it like, listen, I need investors, right? Or, you know, whatever. Do you need to have that end game very clearly defined and not, you know, obviously push it, but where does that come into the equation?
Yeah, it helps, right? Because if you know if you know the path to monetization, then you can really, like where you want to end up. The most important thing is to be like crystal clear around the problem that you're trying to solve, right? Like what they figured out when they wrote Play Bigger, which is like the book that launched category design, is that to become a category queen, category king, the companies that have done this, that have captured 76% of the market share and have become synonymous with the verb, like with the verb for the problem that they solve, they didn't evangelize their brand. They didn't evangelize their product. What they evangelized was a problem, right? And if you can get that point of view around the problem right, it becomes this like giant bat signal that attracts like all the folks that really, really care about this thing, right? The partners and the ecosystem that you need to build, the super consumers that can't wait to like share how they're doing it better than everybody else, and the real people on your team that really, really care, as well as man, points of views have perspective. If you get that right and you get your team around that, then your marketing, your sales, and your product align in like a really unique way that really melts away most of the decision-making fatigue, because you know exactly where you're heading, you know why you're going there, because you know it's based on a context shift. It answers the why now, it answers the where we're going, and it answers the what doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think actually, Josh, like knowing what you're selling is probably like where a lot of organizations stop, and I'm sure you can think of a couple that we've dealt with in the not too distant past. But like knowing that second portion is seems to me like it's absolutely the critical component, right? Like what is our unique POV? Is that aligned with like a real understanding of the market, your ideal buyer, so on. So I'm curious though, Pablo, is that an element? I know you work with a lot of companies to try to define that, right? Like, is that a painful exercise? Because what pops into my mind is just so many organizations that are scared to take a stance on, and I almost feel like unless you're willing to go all in and say like, this is the problem and this is our very unique take on it, that it just becomes really watered down and diluted. So like, is that a challenge to kind of surface within organizations?
There is definitely painful moments, right?
I would imagine.
What I have found that is, the idea of leading a POV exercise and all this stuff is like the last kind of like tool I've added to my tool belt. But as I've done it more and more, and everybody that like mentored me into this, something has proven very, very true, which is the idea that the process of going through it is a deliverable all by itself, right? Like if you can get your stakeholders in a room and get to the point where you agree on the story that you're telling, why it's happening and where it's going, and what the future needs to look like, and everyone in that room agrees to every single word in that 300 word narrative, it's on, baby. Like that's when decision making fatigue really goes away. So, the 2 days of doing that is really by itself a great exercise. Mm-hmm. The thing that I added to the whole equation is that we also turned that into like a content creation exercise, right? So like while people are having these ahas in like real life, you're also getting this like really genuine content about like, but what I care about is this. Why are we doing that? Like that type of stuff, right? So you can make it fun, is what I found.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks, especially in this audience, right? A lot of early stage founders and investors and things like that look for context. So anyone that jumps to mind, obviously not an early stage, doesn't have to be a new company who hasn't totally figured it out, but someone obviously started from nowhere and now has this big market share, big point of view, ideally in B2B SaaS would be helpful for this audience. But anyone that comes to mind that's done this well?
Yeah, man, there's a ton. Right now Clary is doing it really, really well. I would say Copy AI is really on their way to do, like if you want to see someone that's like in the thick of it right now, Copy AI just went from this like process automation, blah, 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 that everybody says, to being super dialed in on a villain and a problem, and this like idea of, I forgot what they call it. They call it like go to market bloat, right? Like how do you eliminate the bloat in your go to market exercise? Clary calls it revenue leak, right? Like Clary has really, Clary's taken this like path of not just launching what they call the first ever revenue management platform, right? Like that's languaging that they've introduced into the market. They've also introduced languaging around the villain called revenue leak. And they've introduced something really, really interesting, which is a KPI to be measured by in their own category, which is revenue under management. They recently realized that they have like whatever $1 billion in revenue under management, put out a press release. They're like, first ever platform with blah, blah, blah revenue under management, man. That's like a super flex that now every other kind of like CRO is like, what is our provider? How much revenue under management does my provider have? Right. So I think those are, the historical examples everybody talks about is like HubSpot and Salesforce and whatever, but these two are doing it in real time right now. And there's a lot to learn from exactly how they're executing it.
Yeah.
That's killer. Good examples.
Yeah, for sure. Like I was just thinking about how, given how critical that is and how many organizations struggle just to differentiate, and that, trickles down into all these different roles. And also what I'm hearing from the massive number of folks that are seemingly reaching out, in the last 2 weeks, it seems like, that are looking for a job. There's definitely a mass influx. I feel like we've been in a recession in B2B SaaS for a good year and a half already. But like, I think it's kind of reaching a different level that's more, a hiring and employee based. But, if folks took that and added that into their interview process, their hiring process, in terms of like determining, is this going to be an organization that I can be successful within, and just really start pinpointing like, what is, our unique POV here. We're going through a different exercise with one of our portcos right now, which is like their, very first sales conversations, like mapping those out and getting really specific on like, yeah, you say you're the best at XYZ, but like, why? You know what I mean? And just kind of really distilling that down into a point to where it's like, all right, well, that's undeniable. Like, and you say like, oh, our implementation is the best, like that's garbage, right? Like we have to get to finite points. And I feel like if you applied that same exercise to finding an organization that you can really thrive in, for the next 2-3 years type of clip, like that would be a really successful way to understand a lot about an organization without, even ever having to step foot there. So, I see uses for that kind of across the board there.
That's a great call, man. Like this idea of we only get so many bites of the apple of who we're gonna, as an employee, right? Like I've now been in the entrepreneurship mind space for very long, but yeah, as an employee, man, like you only get so many bites of the apple. You bring it home with you. All this stuff is happening. If you're not self-selecting to work for a company that's trying to win it all, and not just win a small sector of like, we could be number 2 or 3 in this space, but have like a real category strategy, have a real clear sense of differentiation, right? The era of comparison, it just kind of, it doesn't serve us anymore, man. Like the company that knows why they're different, and not just why they're different, but why the different is so hyper relevant and urgent now. Right? Like why now is a big part of the POV, because the formula for, like whether you have a category is a change in context will create a new missing, which creates a need for a new innovation. And whether it's a new problem that you have to make obvious to the world and undeniable, or it's a new solution that is now you have to make obvious, to this old problem, because now that's undeniable. Then you got a shot. Then you got a real like shot at this like category space.
Yeah, that urgency call out is just so critical right now, because I feel like nothing is getting purchased that doesn't, have the ability to make a direct impact. That like nice to have or efficiency, like those decisions just aren't being made. Like that's a can that's being kicked down the road. But like, can this make us better tomorrow? I think is a real focus in what's actually getting paper inked at the end of the day.
Yeah. And even if you apply it to what you were saying on the hiring front, how many people just take such a generic approach to going and finding a job, as an example, right? Like it's just this black hole of nothingness, like, and the effort shows it, right? But if, to your point, Pablo, if you went and chased after those companies that were inspiring because of that clear value, right, that they're positioning in the market, aren't you going to go put your best foot forward and not just give the generic canned, here's my resume, whatever? Like that's what they're looking for at the end of the day, right? The company is looking for someone that stands out, and
you're looking for opinion on both sides, right? You know what I mean?
Exactly
like,
right. Yeah.
Yeah, companies looking for different too, right? Like you're either
correct.
You as a human being, you either position yourself or you get positioned, right? Like if you get, when I was, pioneering this whole community thing, the first world that kind of opened up to me was like this world of there. I didn't even know there was an industry of community, right? Turns out it's a bunch of like really well-natured people that consider themselves community managers, and man, it's a great hang, right? Like it's a bunch of like people that are gonna like, what do you need? I got you, bro. But at the end of the day, right? Like if those folks aren't positioning themselves close to revenue, guess who got laid off at the beginning of that tech that we've been on for a year and a half, right? It was all the community team.
Yeah,
I'm glad we brought up. Sorry, go ahead, Wex.
Well, I was just going to say, just real quick, we talked about that at Arcadia, right? Like, we talked about the idea that partnerships today, we can say community partnerships, whatever we want to call it, is suffering what we kind of felt marketing in B2B SaaS was suffering from a decade ago, where they're fighting for the seat at the revenue table, right? And we heard that in marketing when Justin and I sold marketing to marketers for a decade, like that was the thing. And now partnerships are kind of in that same boat where it's like, how do I position myself in the org where I can clearly demonstrate my value? And they're having a hard time connecting those dots. So they're in this echo chamber of, well, the CEO doesn't get it. Well, this, well, that. Well, make them get it. You've got to show your value somehow.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great setup because, everything we're talking about here is, you've got to have something that's a hyper-relevant opinion. It's got to have urgency attached to it. It needs to solve a real problem in a different way. But I also feel like, the only solutions that really I believe in, I think a lot of people are gravitating towards these days, like partner ecosystems, like community, they also take a while to build. And it's not like that age-old, like, hey, I'm going to fire up my Google AdWords budget and see, leads come in the door the next day, which I think is why a lot of organizations are struggling to actually get off the ground with these tactics and so on. So, like, how do you fight against the notion of like, what am I going to see tomorrow, or I'm not going to keep investing in this when that time is just a natural ingredient within this recipe here.
Yeah, listen, man. I got asked a similar question at Arcadia. I think you tie yourself to one singular metric, right? Like, what is the metric that you can move the needle on? I'll be honest, guys. Like, I'm not a guy that was like born thinking I was gonna be an entrepreneur or anything like that. I'm just kind of like a passionate, creative guy that's talented enough to go out and get it, and I'm just like here by happenstance. And
I think that's the recipe, by the way. I don't know. Although I was so fucking proud the other day. Like my wife does those little chalkboards for the kids going back to school, and my son wants to be an entrepreneur, but like I did not even know what that meant when I was 7 years old. So
correct,
it just happens. Exactly. He lives in a house with one. But yeah, I mean, I think that is the recipe, by the way.
Oh, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. So like I say all this to say that by the time that my kind of like methodology had matured enough, right? Like I started off, I had these like ideas around building a community. Then I realized that, got to sell the Monday morning problem in mid 2019. The need for content was real. And I realized that the community is like a content flywheel all onto its own. So I sold the community as a content flywheel all onto its own, landed this job with JWB Real Estate Capital. It was my first like $150 million company that brought me on board and gave me a shot. And I'd be lying if I didn't tell you that COVID rapidly accelerated the fact that, the fact that I created a $40 million channel in like 12 months had a lot of good fortune, that came my way from it. And that really led that way. But I spent the next 2 years selling that story and having a really, really hard time of like being able to drive urgency and speed to win and whatnot. Until what I realized was this idea that, and I'm not giving you my pitch. I'm reverse engineering the idea of like tie yourself to a metric. What I realized that like client after client for me has consistently shown me that these channels bring in more revenue from less leads, right? And what I started realizing is that the clients that really, really succeed with this stuff are the types of clients that have their typical clientele is X, and they have an opportunity for like a handful of clients that are like 3 to 5X right off the bat, right? Like whether it's with JWB, who used to sell people saying, hey, can I just invest in one house and let me check it out? And then I'll see if I build a portfolio, to people showing up and saying, you know what, I got about $1.5 million in my retirement. I want to put about 600,000 into this asset class. How many homes can I pick up? And picking up 4 and 5 at a time. To, another client, similar things. I don't want to talk too much about myself, right? But like the idea of, hey, how do we drive more of these like ideal clients that are 3 to 5x that make your business better all the way around, and you can have more of those, became the thing that I'm like, oh, okay, I'm talking to founders. I know they want this stuff, and they want this stuff happening right now. That became the thing that I sell well before community. And what happens for me tomorrow is we get this POV going, man. This POV going, yeah, cool. It's a bat signal. It's going to be the center narrative. It's going to, allow you to develop speed. But guess what? You start inserting this language into sales calls tomorrow, your conversion rate's going to go up. So let's start tracking conversion rates today using this language versus the other language. And as this is happening, you know that this dial is turning while we're getting to this other dial, and we're getting in more conversations with these people, right? So like aligning to the right metric is right. Like if I was thinking from a partner standpoint, I'd be thinking the same way, right? Like if I'm trying to sell myself as a partner leader, I would be thinking, hey, you know what's weak over here in your business metrics? Again, it takes being able to read a balance sheet.
Correct.
Like understanding that stuff. And I was fortunate that I was hired by a Fortune 500 company and trained in all this stuff when I was 22. But like, you got to be able to like poke a hole at your go-to-market and say, I can solve this, man. And if I can show you, if I can tell you what I can do on day 1 that leads to day 365, and we can create a metric that shows that we're tracking on day 1 to day 365, now you're cooking with grease.
Yeah. I mean, that simplicity is key.
Yep. Yeah, I think, you have to game the system to a certain extent. Like you've got to find something, to your point, where it's like, yeah, that's something that I can impact, because I know no one's going to sign on to go on this ride with me. If I walk in the door, and this is my problem with RevOps across the board, like just unabashedly, like, nope, we don't sell, we don't influence revenue. Like we just make, your systems work better together. It's like, dude, that's a terrible sales pitch. Like you have to, be able to position yourself as someone that can impact what the company cares about, even if it's not the long game that you're looking for them to ultimately invest in. But you've got to create those steps along the way. Like coming in and just saying like, yeah, it's going to be 2 years before I can, show you anything of substance, in fill in the blank, is just a crazy, terrible way to try to get things done. So couldn't agree with that more. And by the way, that's the only answer I ever hear where people have succeeded in terms of that question, is like, you've got to figure something out that you can impact that is going to increase that trust, the buy-in, all the same stuff that you want to increase through community. So it's kind of an internal community building exercise.
Yeah, Pablo, I think I told you we were closing our most recent investment right around the time we were at the event, and we do a go-to-market kickoff workshop, shortly after that closes, and we just finished that last week in Texas. And I was talking to one of the company leaders yesterday. We didn't get a ton of time to spend in their specific marketing function while we were there, and we were all very impressed that they had already created some organic inbound interest, right? And, we said for marketing, we want to keep it super simple, right? Like we want to grow inbound, and that's it. We're going to measure that one thing. Like, does inbound interest go from here to here? We don't need to measure anything else, right? And she was like, oh, I'm so glad you want to keep it simple and this and that. So I think just being able to tie someone to something that's easy to measure, it's not hard. We can all agree on it, that it has an impact on the business is definitely the way to go. Well, I know you touched on it a little bit, but here's the opportunity. We'd love to hear about Be the Stage. Love to hear about your podcast. Tell us about you and your business. I
mean, I feel like I've been like peppered my business in throughout all of this, but that motion of start with a POV, end with a owned event, within 24 months, and this like community of super consumers and kick in the door for either you're trying to go up market or you're trying to like change your customer profile. That's what we do, right? Like it's the whole do the POV, create the content that you can inject into like your already existing pipes, build a podcast so that you can have the ongoing conversations, run the live events, get that whole operation going, strategize, execute on the in-person events when you are borrowing people's events until you launch your own events. We do all of that stuff as a turnkey service with what people do. And
What
that's
does your
what
perfect
business
customer
agents,
look like?
man. What?
What's your perfect customer look like?
As I said, not a natural entrepreneur here, just learning as I go. I'm the last guy to kind of figure out what my niche is. And I realized that the Not Your Average Investor Show thing and JWB has given me gave me like an open door into like the real estate market, but it didn't really fit with real estate investors. And then I also realized that what I do, community and content, is like what SaaS companies, B2B SaaS companies want. So
Right.
where I'm finding a lot of success right now is vertical SaaS for the real estate investment kind of like service community is where I'm eating it up. But I'll be honest, man, like I I went to Arcadia and I'm just like, oh my God, anybody with a partner ecosystem like needs this, right? Like you need something to be inviting people to like nonstop to develop your partner ecosystem. So I think the end goal is to just really go into like different vertical SaaS, because that really allows well for community. That allows for,
I like that.
Hunting this like big enterprise client while landing the small fish that are using it on the way there. But it's been a journey, man. It's been interesting.
Very good. Well, I see you've got your email address there on the screen. Hopefully that's intentional, but it's Pablo@bethestage.live. Anywhere else folks can find you? LinkedIn? Is there a community they should join? What's the word?
Yeah. LinkedIn is my love language, man. The thing is, my name is Pablo Gonzalez, and that's like the name of like the John Smiths that have 5 kids and name them all John Smith. So it's tough to find, but I'm connected to both of you guys. So Pablo Gonzalez with a Z at the end and Be the Stage. Community-wise, we launched this community around category design a little bit over a year ago. It's called Category Thinkers. If you wanna hop in there, it's a little boutique community in a Slack channel with a couple of super consumers that talk about it nonstop, and you'll find some good guidance. But that's I want to be people's friends. More than anything, though, I would say if I have a call to action is I know the effort it takes to like have a podcast, care about it, bring people on, produce it, share it. And what I like to tell people is that if you've gotten value out of, like listening to me and Josh and Justin rattle on right now, the number one thing you can do for me is like go give them like a 5-star, kind of like click. It's one click. You don't have to write a review. If you write a review, you're even cooler. But my dream scenario would be that like Josh or Justin are just like, dude, this person reached out to us because they thought you were smart, and I want to introduce you now. So go through you guys, give you guys some love, man. I've been listening to the show. I love it.
That's
All
awesome.
right,
Man.
very good. Well, that's usually part of my wrap up, so I'll leave that with you. The only other thing I will add is Go-to-Market Cheat Code, the book, is coming out in January of 2025. You can pre-order it now on Amazon. So just go to Amazon and search Go-to-Market Cheat Code. It should come right up. You'll see a little Nintendo video game remote on there to know it's the right book. I know Pablo bought a copy at Arcadia. He got one of these cool hats, as well as a number of other folks. So free gifts will be coming out for folks as we get those pre-orders coming in for those early adopters. Pablo, thanks so much for joining the show. It's a pleasure having you.
Thanks, guys. I really, sharing your stage with me is obviously something I really, really appreciate, man. So thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. That's been another episode of the Go-to-Market Cheat Code. See you next time.